Let's go to our next question, and that comes from Rob Ward.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. My question goes to my friend Tim Costello. Tim, you've recently been reported as saying that Christians should calm down in the face of what would seem to be an increasing intolerance of the Christian faith. So my question is, should Luke and Carla Burrell, publishers of White, the wedding magazine, forced out of business for failing to promote same-sex marriage, should they calm down? Should Joshua, the uni student, suspended for daring to pray, should he calm down? And what about the Melbourne IT specialist, fired for privately expressing concerns about the Safe Schools program? Should he calm down? What do we do?
So,
Tim, that's especially yours.
Thank you. I was speaking to my mob, the Christian mob. I would also say to some on the hard secular left, they should calm down. And I think I paraphrased Jesus, who said, turn the other cheek. My paraphrase was, calm down and suck it up. And by that, I'm saying we've just elected our first Pentecostal Prime Minister, who could pray openly for 6 minutes at Hillsong and talk openly about his faith. This notion that we're victimised, we're persecuted. I'll show you real persecution in my World Vision work, where Christians really are suffering. But to your question, I do think there are real issues around freedom of religion. I think freedom of religion is actually good for society. Freedom of Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Christians to actually run institutions, have schools, charities that express their vision of flourishing is good in a democratic society. And I do think there are loopholes. I know in New South Wales that you can be sacked because of your religion. An employer can say to a woman wearing a hijab, you're scaring the customers, you're fired. I think that's not on. I think, to go to what's behind your question, that Christians should be working this out sensibly, because I think there's a lot of victim claiming and we're persecuted, which is overreach. I think there are solutions. If I criticise left and right, and I try and say I try not to go left or right, I try to say go deeper, I think left and right want to keep the war going often, and overreach and hysteria keeps the war going. In the middle's us, the exhausted middle, who want to compromise and live together. And I think we can find solutions to this. I do blame social media in part, which actually says, you disagree with me equals you hate me, and I'm going to hate you back. I think overborne statements from my mob, Christians saying we're now persecuted, though there are real issues, don't help in that sense of the culture wars going on, and to find compromise and acceptance.
Tim, the other part of your quote, I think, in that calm down, Jesus didn't go around demanding legislation to protect his rights. Kimberly, do you think we need legislation to protect religious rights, freedoms?
Well, the government is proposing legislation and we're still waiting to see it. I think they're working through their backbench to come up with what I think is going to be a minimalist model. I don't actually know, but I think that's what it seems like. One of the reasons this is so difficult, I think, is, Eric and I were actually both on the Senate Select Committee for Same-Sex Marriage, where we started to look at these issues. We then had a Ruddock review, because in fact it became very difficult to really, in the time allotted for the inquiry, to come to a point where we could solve these issues. And in fact, you can see now that this inquiry, the Ruddock review, was released rather belatedly last year, but it's taken some time. We're now in July, soon to be August, and we still don't really have anything. We then had a religious freedoms inquiry in one of the Senate standing committees. That also didn't really come to any view, and in fact one of the recommendations was to go to the Law Reform Commission, and that was around students and teachers, so Section 37 of the Sex Discrimination Act particularly. But I do think that from the evidence that committee heard, that there are people who really do feel that they cannot express their view. I don't think it is helpful to look at this in some dialectic where you've got, people looking for certain rights, their rights to be protected against other people. We live in a society where, dare I say it, thank God, we do have a contest of rights. And we are very lucky to live in a society where we do have that. So we are not as Asia Bibi in Pakistan.
Okay,
So-
we've got a few questions around this issue. So why don't we go to our next question now from Sarah Cogger, and we'll keep this sort of discussion around this issue going.
Good evening, thank you. Another question for you, Tim. Many Christians support Israel Folau, not because of his specific views, but because they believe it's both unlawful and morally wrong for an employer to terminate an employee's contract for their public expression of Christian faith. And yet Jesus commanded us to turn the other cheek, which presumably still applies in the case of unlawful persecution. So if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. How should Christians respond to Israel's case in light of Jesus' command?
Actually, Tim, I'm not going to give that to you. I'm going to give that one to Eric first off. You can come to it in a minute. Eric?
Look, our society has been based on freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of association, of which freedom of religion is a subset. And that is why I think we have one of the best cultures and societies in the world, because that has been one of our foundation stones. That is part and parcel of the ICCPR, Article 18, if I recall correctly, that freedom of religion is deemed in international law to be one of those fundamental rights that the state cannot take away from you unless it is absolutely necessary. And so going to Tim's point, it's okay if you're the Prime Minister, you can pray for 6 minutes at Hillsong, but what happens if you are a rugby player who gets sacked because of certain pressure? What happens especially to the Pacific Islander kids who are of the Christian faith, growing up in Western Sydney, aspiring to become rugby players like Izzy Folau, and they seem sacked? What does that tell them about the Christian faith, their right to freedom of expression, freedom of association and freedom of belief?
Isn't that exactly the same argument that Rugby Australia uses for what about the young kids who are gay, who see, a footballer who's paid a lot of money and one of their stars of the league saying they're going to burn in hell? You're both concerned for the young people.
In fairness, look, he also said unless they repent, but that is where I
Well,
believe that
I don't
we
think
as a
sexuality
society...
is something to repent for.
Sorry?
I don't think sexuality is a repenting thing, is it?
Look, I don't want to get into a theological discussion.
Oh, let's have
I
it.
think
Let's
we're
go.
here. I think we're in the middle of one.
Because this is a matter of freedom of speech, and it does come to pass that there will be a conflict of ideas, a clash of ideas, and therefore it is the question of how you go about it, and should somebody lose their employment because they hold this particular view. My approach to this is right, wrong or indifferent. Izzy Folau had the right to say that on his Instagram, and who was part and parcel of his Instagram? It was somebody looking at it and then publicising it further. And so if you can't have that basic communication within our society, then I think we've got a real problem where people are not allowed to give expression to that which they believe.
Tim, just on the theological point, I think, of Sarah's question, which is, should Christians be turning the other cheek, not heading to the courts?
Yeah, I believe that. For the first
in Israel Folau's case?
Yeah. Look, my position's complex. I think Rugby Australia, and corporates for that matter, shouldn't have some fundamental right about their corporate reputation and their brand over against rights of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So I support Izzy Folau's freedom to quote, in his case, to misquote the Bible. I also know that LGBTQI advocates are saying we're just trying to keep young gay people alive. This is not about attacking freedom of religion. This is actually about keeping them alive. It's what I mean by calm down. Let's find a centre here. I personally believe that schools that are Christian, Muslim, Jewish should be able to teach that gender is binary without being carted off to a tribunal, even though that's not officially the politically correct position. That free speech and debate actually deals with these issues much better than legislation. I would say I didn't hear you, Eric, when Scott McIntyre, the SBS employee. He was dismissed for saying some volatile things about Anzacs. He lost his job too. I think there's often double standards here, that we only pick up one set of rights, which is why I'm calling for a calm debate, because I think legislation isn't a silver bullet. It won't cover all of this situation. We actually need to find that middle ground and respect these rights in balance.
Adam?
We live in a country where everybody is free to practice their religion, provided it is consistent with the secular laws of the land. And we are an expressly non-discriminatory country. There's always going to be an area of tension where religion, which prescribes moral correctness and a set way of living, is going to come into tension with non-discrimination. I completely agree with Tim that this is an area where we need common sense. We don't need to rush to legislation to try and correct everything that we see as being wrong. If you look at the Israel Folau case, think of the absolute absurdity where you have an organisation like Rugby Australia, which is stated on the front of their website that they are about diversity of gender, diversity of sexuality, and they are absolutely powerless to stop one of their prime employees, contractors, whatever his situation may be, from consistently undermining the aims of their organisation just because he happens to not just believe something but believe it really, really strongly.
So it seems to be...
So in the name of inclusion, we're excluding him.
No,
in the name of tolerance, we're saying he can't say that which he wants to say.
He can say it
Then
as
there's a
much
flip
as he
side
likes.
of that, isn't there?
He can say that as much as he likes, but does Rugby Australia have to keep paying him while he was saying that against their wishes?
Isn't Rugby Australia about getting the best possible players on the field, and it's about rugby and it's not about religious beliefs?
That is
I would
absolutely
like
not
to
the
see a Rugby Australia team that can have Christians, atheists, Muslims, just as long as they know how to play the game.
In modern sport,
Okay.
in modern sport, athletes are not just about what they do on the field. Israel Folau should know this better than anyone because he was paid millions of dollars to play AFL, a game that he is not very good
And
at.
what about
hang
all
on,
the
hang on,
blokes
hang on,
that drink too
hang on,
much,
hang on,
but
hang on,
they're
Parnell.
kept on?
I know a bit about brands. Izzy
I've got a
Folau's a brand and
constructive-
so is Rugby Australia.
Absolutely, and I've got a constructive suggestion for this. How about he gets paid for sports balling a certain amount, and he gets paid as a brand ambassador a certain amount, and then if he doesn't do what he's told to as a brand ambassador, they stop paying him that amount and he still gets paid for sports balling. You know, quite simple. Let's just divorce what this is about, because frankly it's also down to Rugby Australia in this not being very clear about what that brand ambassador role was. So
Is that the case, not being clear? He'd been warned once and then re-signed after that, didn't he?
His warnings were very unclear in themselves, it seems. So he was just to be respectful. Now, to somebody who believes his faith the way he does, quoting a passage from the Bible or misquoting a passage from the Bible, what's disrespectful about that? What's the problem with that? So I really think that I couldn't agree more with what you're both saying about this is not about legislation. This has to be sorted out by common sense. But there are also things that you can do from a very concrete perspective to just separate the issues that we've got, that we're dealing with here. Brands and actions and jobs can be separated out.
Okay, before we leave this topic or this spiritual domain, our next question comes from Selena Gretsch.
Thanks, Fran. What does the panel think about Scott Morrison's recent appearance at a Hillsong conference promoting his Christian beliefs while acting in his role as the leader of a secular, multicultural, multi-faith country?
Kimberly, guess what? That's yours.
Thanks, Selena. I think, look, I actually, if people have a faith, I think that's actually really good, very helpful, probably even more so in Parliament. I think it probably is a source of strength that is sometimes much needed. But I actually don't have a problem if he wants to go and, you know, profess his faith and talk about his faith. I don't really, I mean, that's his private time. I understand what you're saying. He's also the Prime Minister of our country. But I think you'd find that in Parliament there are some very strong believers and he is one of them.
It's what's different, and this perhaps goes to the question to Selena's question, is in the election campaign, of course, he invited the cameras in to see him pray. That's an unusual thing.
It is unusual, and it's more, I think we see it in other countries around the world more so than we have seen here, which brings in another question, I think, around, I think the influencing perhaps from the United States and from its political campaigning. But if people have deep belief, I don't really have a problem with that.
Can I say that I do think something has changed. Eric may remember this. I remember my brother, when he went into politics, saying he was advised, don't talk about your religion, it's a secular country, they'll think you're a fanatic. Something has shifted where now, and I think this is good, you can be upfront about your faith. And I like the fact that Scott Morrison said, I'm upfront about my faith, encouraging everyone else to be upfront about their faith.
When you say something has shifted, do you think it's only shifted since this Prime Minister has done it?
No, I think it's been shifting for some time. And I think it's a global zeitgeist there, where religion literally is back as a force. John Kerry said if he had his time over again as Secretary of State, he would study religion to understand geopolitics. So something has profoundly shifted. The thing I'd add is the interesting thing, I think, that Scott Morrison's going to find out is that probably for the next 3 years, we're going to be having debates about what Christianity really means. I've got secular journalists ringing me now who are thumbing through the Bible for the first time in their lives. And they're saying...
Which Bible?
My Bible. And I'll just say, Izzy Folau's list that was from Ephesians. There's another book in the Bible which starts like his list. God says, I'm going to judge sorcerers, perjurers, adulterers, and those who defraud their labourers from proper wages and oppress the foreigner in our midst, think refugees, and the widow and orphan, think New Start. There's a whole lot more in the Bible that I'm up for discussing.
Okay. Adam, are you comfortable with this?
Why not? Millions of Australians go to church of all denominations all over. It doesn't mean that our Prime Minister has to go to every single church. It doesn't mean he has to be every single Australian. He can still conduct himself as Prime Minister in a way that is befitting of governing and being a Member of Parliament for all Australians while still having a faith.
Parnell?
I couldn't agree more, and I think look, Julia Gillard was our first openly atheist Prime Minister, right? And that was actually quite important. It's important that we're tolerant to every outlook on life that is not harming others. So it was wonderful to hear her say, I'm an atheist, that's just how I feel about life, because for a long time that was something politicians couldn't say. You had to pretend to have some kind of a faith. And it's wonderful, on the other hand, to hear somebody sincerely profess their faith, not hold it as a political instrument, but simply hold it and say, this is me, but I'm not going to impose it on everybody else.
Eric, is Parnell onto something? It did seem risky, I remember, when Julia Gillard declared herself an atheist, and perhaps some think it is risky for this current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to be so public with his faith. Is that, in a secular society that we are, we've seen it as risky in the past to have these extremes, is perhaps not the quite right word, but declarative positions?
Our fellow Australians are very tolerant, and they look at people on their performance. And they judged Julia Gillard not on her atheism, but on the government. They judged Scott Morrison not on his Christianity, but on his performance. But one thing I will say to this audience is, it's amazing how many people of the left side of politics have expressed concern about Scott Morrison's profession of faith, yet was strangely silent when Kevin Rudd continually had press conferences outside of church in the lead up to him becoming Prime Minister. His Christian faith seemed to be okay, but Scott Morrison, from the Liberal side, that seems to be a problem.
I don't know. I think
we need some
commentary about that too.
I think we need some consistency here.
All right.
But if we are genuinely tolerant, multi-faith, multicultural society, it stands to reason that sometimes we will throw up a Christian Prime Minister, sometimes an atheist Prime Minister, and that's the way it ought to be.
Okay, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter, and keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results.